Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And let's continue our discussion about digestion and nutrition. And inevitably, since we are human beings, our discussion is actually going to be swayed towards human nutrition and digestion, with only a mention of other organisms along the way, unfortunately. So when we finished off, I was telling you about the essential substances. Essential substances are those substances which we cannot actually synthesize ourselves. And we require a dietary source of these substances. I did not actually list any of them. I just told you basically that there are fatty acids, amino acids, etc., that are essential. But maybe it's useful for you to know which those actually are. This slide is not currently in your notes, but I'll make sure that it goes up on Canvas. I'll replace the notes set. First of all, there are two fatty acids which are particularly important for human beings, where it is particularly important that we have a dietary source. And these are the linoleic acids, alpha linoleic and linoleic acid, very easily obtained from our diet. You will often see these referred to as the omega fatty acids, omega-3 and omega-6. And that's in the health food section. You will see bottles and bottles and bottles of tablets of omega-3 and omega-6. But in actual fact, these are very easily obtained if you eat fish. Fish are particularly rich in the omega fatty acids. But if you do not eat fish, or if you're a vegetarian, you can actually still get a good source of fatty acids from grains and seeds. But the essential fatty acids, this is one area where vegetarians and vegans do get into trouble sometimes. They need to make sure that they do have an adequate source of these fatty acids. The amino acids, there are 9 amino acids which are essential. Remember that we use 20, so there's only 9 of them, but just less than half. Phenylalanine, valine, threonine, tryptophan, methionine, leucine, isoleucine, lysine, and histidine. These are all essential amino acids. We do not synthesize them, but in virtually any source of protein is extremely rich in all of these. So again, if you're vegan or vegetarian, you might want to be a bit careful. Make sure that you are having adequate protein source. But virtually any complex protein will contain these. Although we do not synthesize them ourselves, we have to obtain them in our diet. Now, most of the vitamins are essential in that we don't synthesize most of them except for vitamin D. Vitamin D, we synthesize our own vitamin D by being exposed to sunlight. It is synthesized by the skin. But most of the other vitamins are essential. We have to obtain them from diet. But vitamin K and some of the B vitamins are also produced by gut bacteria. It's one of the very useful aspects of our microbiota in our gut, is that they do produce vitamins. Okay, so that's just a useful list for you. Hold on. So also essential in our diet is a source of minerals. And these are elements which very often participate in metabolic processes, but are also part of our biomass. And some of them pretty much obviously. Calcium, for example, and phosphorus. Most of our the mineralization of our bones is by deposition of crystals of calcium phosphate. But calcium and phosphorus both play very, very important roles in metabolism and in physiology as well. But they are very important structural elements. Sulfur potassium, chlorine, sodium, magnesium. These are all essential as well. But any normal diet will provide them in sufficient quantities. Supplementing minerals is not necessarily a good thing to do. In health food aisles, you will be exhorted to increase this or increase that or increase the next thing in order to avoid all sorts of dreadful maladies. This is not necessarily a good thing. If you have a good, rich, balanced diet of vegetables and as well as a source of protein, good source of protein, normally you supply all of the essential nutrients that you require. There are a few elements which we require in very, very low amounts. This whole list here we require in, I wouldn't say in high amounts, but in relatively high amounts. These we require in very, very low amounts. Iron, which is most importantly component of blood, but does also participate in a couple of other metabolic processes. Fluorine is important in maintenance of teeth, of enamel structure of the teeth, and in formation of the enamel structure, of strong enamel structure of the teeth. And lastly, iodine, that's the last one we'll consider. Iodine is very important as a component of thyroid hormones, and that becomes very relevant when we think of the massive impact that thyroid hormones have on our whole physiology, because they affect our metabolism. They regulate our metabolism. So a good source of iodine is essential. And people who suffer from iodine deficiencies begin to suffer from very distinct disease processes. Okay, so on the topic of dietary deficiency, you can certainly suffer from deficiencies of, for example, of the essential nutrients, particularly if you have an unbalanced diet or whatever. But when the diet is deficient overall, when an individual simply is not getting enough food to eat, for example, then we begin to see some very, very distinct patterns, some very distinct etiologies. And the body, for example, if we are starved of nutrients, we will start to use up what we have as if it was a store. We do definitely store nutrients, especially for energy, in the form of glycogen and of the fats. But if we are starved for any length of time, then we'll begin to use up those reserves. And the sorts of things that you'll see are very distinct. This poor little chap here is suffering from what is referred to as merasmus, M-A-R-A-S-M-U-S, merasmus. And merasmus is general starvation of all nutrients. So this child has been starved both of calories, of a caloric source of energy, mainly carbohydrates, and has been starved of protein as well. And when that happens, then the body goes through a series of, steps. You first of all use up the readily accessible reserves. That is all your glycogen. That's quite quickly used up. And then you'll begin to access the fats and storage material. That explains why the wasting that you see when the fat layers under the skin are reduced as the fat begins to be used up. Once all of that has been used up, then the body begins to attack its own protein. And especially in the muscle, it will go first the muscles, but then the organs, and very lastly, the brain. And this is one of the huge dangers of starvation in a child, is a child that is suffering from marasmus like this does not have many reserves left, except for the body to start attacking the protein in the brain and trying to use that. And the body is essentially using protein as a source of energy. It's not using protein to maintain biomass, it's using protein as a source of energy. Once a child has been starved like this, they have almost certainly suffered irreversible brain damage. There is another form of gross malnutrition, however, which looks a little bit deceptive. If you look at this baby here, you might think at first that this child is actually looks quite healthy, and it looks sort of plumpish and everything else. It's a little bit difficult to discern, but the first thing to notice is this very swollen stomach here, and this is a case where this child has been given sufficient energy resources, especially in the form of carbohydrates, but is being starved of protein. And this is very typical where a society, for example, as is the case in many areas, for example, in Africa, the diet is very rich in carbohydrate with a small amount of protein, which is a very healthy diet because we don't actually need that much protein. But the carbohydrate provides all the energy and everything else. It doesn't provide the building blocks for biomass. So when a child is starved of protein but given sufficient energy source, this is the result. It's a disease called Kwashiorkor. And in Kwashiorkor, the protein levels are too low for the child to grow properly or to maintain proper homeostasis, proper metabolic processes and everything. And it's a very, very dangerous thing because the child may look deceptively well, but in fact, they have some hallmarks. The hair has a characteristic look to it, a very dry, staring look, and often it is reddish in color. The skin is very dry and scaly, and they have this swollen stomach as well. And most of this plumpish looking, that is actually deceptive. It's very often fluid. So this child is actually almost as sick as this child, and maybe have suffered brain damage from protein deprivation as well. So let's just in general think a little bit about the digestive nutrition and digestive processes. Well, first of all, we have to eat. We have to take material into the gut cavity. Most organisms have a complete gut cavity. Most animals have a complete gut. That is that it has a mouth and it has an anus. It's a hollow tube which runs right through the body. That may sound like a simple statement of fact, but is really important because having a gut cavity means that we have a limited volume. And as most of our digestive processes are external digestive processes, we pour enzymes and things into a cavity to digest food in that cavity. Having that limited volume is really important. It enables us to concentrate the enzymes and to concentrate them in particular places. What we're going to see as we move down that tube, different regions of the tube have different functions. So, for example, digestion starts in the mouth, and the first of the digestive processes are mechanical. That is grinding food, and grinding food or tearing it, whatever the animal needs to do to get it into pieces that are small enough for the digestive processes to work efficiently. In addition, during this mechanical grinding of the food, tearing and grinding of the food, the animal may produce saliva, which contains enzymes. The saliva also has mucus in it, which binds the food particles together. But encased in that is going to be enzymes as well, maybe enzymes as well, which begin the processes of digestion, of chemical digestion. Most of the chemical digestion is going to take place within a gut. Guts vary tremendously. The structure of guts varies tremendously depending upon the diet. And in organisms such as the rabbit or other herbivores that depend very heavily on plant material, the gut may be very long and it may be very, very complex because the animal has to try and extract energy and everything, nutrient, from a virtually indigestible material, which is cellulose. We do not. Our gut, we are more omnivorous, and we tend to have a shorter gut because we do depend on much more on meat, which is very easily digested. During the process of passage through the gut, the enzymes surround the food particles and digest the macromolecules into such small molecules that they can actually be absorbed. They can be absorbed across the gut wall efficiently, and they're then transported to the rest of the animal by the blood system, and we'll discuss the detail of that in a minute. The undigested material is not useless because in actual fact, it first of all contains a lot of water, and the hind part of the gut is usually designed to extract as much water as possible and may also extract some minerals. The rest is compacted and is voided as the feces. Throughout the gut, I'll just mention, throughout the gut, there is a very, very rich bacterial population. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time to discuss its functions, but it transpires as research proceeds that microbial population performs many, many useful functions. I've mentioned vitamin production, but it seems that this bacterial population interacts with our immune system, with hormonal systems, there are all sorts of very intricate linkages. So you can think of it this way, even whether you're a rabbit or a human being, in actual fact, when you eat, you're not only feeding yourself, you're feeding your microbiome. And the microbiome in turn is rewarding you with certain products. I'll just tell you one interesting thing. Unfortunately, we're not going to discuss all the different kinds of digestive systems. In herbivores, digestive systems are particularly interesting because they are completely unable, vertebrates are completely unable to digest cellulose, which would be a very rich source of energy because cellulose is a polymer of glucose. So if you could find a way to digest cellulose, it would be very useful. Well, the herbivores do digest cellulose, but they do it with the assistance of gut bacteria. And they often have elaborate areas of the gut where they culture special bacteria and ciliates and other things to digest the cellulose and produce products which can be absorbed by the animal. Rabbits do have an extensive gut, and they have an extensive part of the gut called the cecum, where this kind of digestion takes place, but it is incomplete digestion. And you may, if you've ever had rabbits, you may have seen this. If not, you may not know it. Rabbits have a two-stage digestive system. They eat lots of vegetable matter, and they produce feces, which are not really feces. They are pre digested food. And the rabbits will actually re-eat those pellets and pass the whole lot through the digestive system again, and then only produce proper fecal pellets. So this is particularly at night. Rabbits will spend some time producing the eatable pellets, the eatable food, re-eating what they have already eaten, and then eventually pooping it out. This is not as extraordinary as it sounds, because if you think about things, those groups of animals that we call the ruminants, like cows, in fact, effectively, they do a similar thing. During the day or during times of the day, certain times of the day, they will eat as much grass as they possibly can. And they will fill a part of the stomach called the rumen. And then they will later, either when they're just standing quietly under the trees or at night, they will bring up that grass and they will re-chew it. And they'll re-chew it, and it gets passed to another part of the digestive system where bacteria and ciliates and everything can digest it more easily. So there's all of these herbivores, they have to adopt these special strategies if they want to make use of the cellulose. We do not. Most of the cellulose we eat, most of it passes straight through our gut as fiber. It's very important. Your gut depends upon a certain quantity of fiber to work properly, but we do not digest cellulose. So looking at the whole animal kingdom, here are different feeding methods. There are many, many animals which, in aquatic systems especially, which we refer to as suspension feeders. What they're doing, they are trying to get food out of the water, especially which is in suspension. And they do so usually by having some method of filtering. You will also see them referred to as the filter feeders. These go all the way from these huge animals, like the whales, which filter out small animals in the seawater with specially modified hair called baleen, all the way to small organisms, barnacles, many marine organisms, mussels, clams, all of these things pull water through a filtration system in order to extract the food from it. Now, those are suspension or filter feeders. Many of the organisms which are particularly important to us in agriculture are substrate feeders. Substrate feeders are things which eat a standing object. So, for example, the caterpillar is feeding on a plant. That is a substrate feeder. You might also have substrate feeders that feed, for example, on a dead body or something like that. Those would also be substrate feeders. Fluid feeders extract liquid food, and those are especially things like the biting insects, like mosquitoes, certain flies, that sort of thing. The vast majority of terrestrial organisms are bulk feeders, and that is us. Bulk feeders are those which feed on whole large pieces of material, and they've spectacularly shown a python eating an antelope, but us sitting down to chicken dinner would not be that different. We are also bulk feeders. So in the simpler organisms, food may be taken into the cells directly. Remember, at some point or another, we have discussed things like amoeba, which form food vacuoles. They invert the cell membrane to enclose food in some way, and they enclose it in a food vacuole that then gets united with vacuoles or vesicles containing digestive enzymes to digest the food and absorb it into the cytoplasm. that is not a strategy that is much resorted to in higher organisms, and especially as soon as an organism acquires a gut. Even a simple gut, for example, if we look at something like the Hydra, we see that a lot of its digestive processes are external digestive processes. The cells release digestive enzymes, break down the food, and either food particles or molecules are then absorbed. In something as simple as the Hydra, you may have a mixture of the two processes. They may be able to absorb molecules directly that have been digested, but they also take in food particles. We do not. Our nutrition is by absorption of molecules of broken down materials. But in something even as simple as a Hydra, this external digestion is made possible by the fact that they have a gut at all. The Hydra would not be able to perform this external digestion like this if it did not have a gut, because it would simply, if it was just liberating these enzymes into the water, they would be diluted. So that is a real function of the gut. This is a simple gut. It only has a mouth. All the waste materials must be spat out of the mouth, as well as food must be taken in by the mouth. So it's a very inefficient system. In most animals, the gut is complete. And that is, as I've said, you have a mouth and an anus. And the tube is called the alimentary canal. And the alimentary canal can be divided up. It can have specialized functions in different areas, and they are usually separated from one another by some means, very often by having muscular sphincters, which can isolate one area from the other and yet still pass food between them when necessary. Just that we won't do it in any detail. This is just to show you, this is an annelid, this is an arthropod, and here is a vertebrate, a bird. In all of them is basically the same idea. What we're seeing is, especially as we get up to the vertebrates, which can have very, very complex digestive systems, they are elaborations on the simple tube that we see in the annelids. We look at the bird, what have we got? We've got a tube. It's just that it's more complex. Often its structure and function tied very closely to the actual diet of the organism. If we look at ourselves, at our own digestive system, well, this is probably familiar to many of you, but nonetheless, we'll think about it in these terms. First of all, it's a tube, right? It's a tube which runs all the way through us. But our gut is divided into very, very distinct areas. And the first part of our digestive system is, of course, the mouth up here. Here's the tube running all the way through, expanded into the stomach. A very long area here called the small intestine here. The small intestine gives way to the large intestine here, or the colon, and ultimately the rectum, where the waste material, the feces, may be briefly stored before expulsion. So there's our tube. But associated with that tube are very important sets of glands. And they're called the accessory glands. And they are as follows: the salivary glands of the mouth, which produce saliva. Saliva is actually a very complex material. It's liquid, but it has a certain amount of mucus in it. And it also contains the very first of all of the digestive enzymes, which is amylase. And amylase will begin to break down starch. Starch, you'll remember, is a complex carbohydrate. It's many, many glucose units all joined together. And it's largely insoluble. But amylase will break it down into smaller and smaller units, and break it down so much that it will form small sugar units, disaccharides and things. If you want to try this out, take a piece of ordinary white dry bread, put it in your mouth, and you know that familiar kind of dull taste. Start chewing it, chew it and chew it and chew it and chew it and chew it, and see what happens. And you will perceptibly see that it gets sweeter and sweeter and sweeter. As the amylase begins to break down all the starches in the bread, you begin to be able to taste the sweetness. So our very first digestive process takes place here in the mouth. The food is swallowed. We'll talk about this in a minute because it's a complex process. The food is swallowed and it passes into the stomach. In the stomach, a whole other set of digestive processes begins. The stomach is a complex organ, and here the real digestive processes start. We start now to break down the proteins, especially. The food is mixed into a form which is passed on into the small intestine. As it enters the small intestine, it encounters digestive juices, digestive enzymes from this organ here, which is the pancreas. The pancreas is one of our most important digestive glands. It produces many, many enzymes and various other substances, which are passed into the gut. The digestion continues all the way through the small intestine, and most of the absorption of material takes place in the lower part of the small intestine. The upper part is devoted to digestive process. Then much of the absorption takes place in the lower part of the small intestine. Material is then passed into the colon. This is the ascending colon. This is called the transverse colon, and this is the descending colon. And in the colon, a number of processes take place, but not so much digestive. There is some a bit of nutrient absorption, but the main function of the colon is, first of all, to house a very, very rich microflora. There is a huge microflora in the colon, which appears to be extremely important to our health. The second thing that happens in the colon is that a lot of water is absorbed from, and the material begins to get compressed into what we would recognize as feces. And it is stored briefly in the lower part of the colon, and then before defecation passes into the rectum. That's what produces, that's the feeling of urgency, and is then voided. So we have here a very complex tube, different functions all the way along. The mouth with its salivary glands, the stomach, digestive organ in itself, but also for storage. Food may remain there for a number of hours. Then small intestine, and supplying the small intestine with digestive enzymes are the pancreas, very importantly. What I did not mention, the liver, and that's here. The liver actually has two functional parts, the liver itself and the gallbladder. And they all produce substances which are important for digestion, which are passed here into the small intestine, then to the large intestine, and then to the anus. The different parts of this tube may be isolated from one another by sphincters, by circular muscular units which can close off the tube. We notice this particularly at the top and bottom of the stomach, but there's also some control of passage here, for example. And then, of course, the anus itself is a very complex sphincter structure. So sphincters all may be present at different parts of the tube in order to isolate different areas, one from the other. and then they open to allow food to pass. The passage of material through this tube all the way along is driven by contractions of circular and longitudinal muscles in the gut, which produces characteristic pulsing movement, which moves food along, which we call peristalsis. And that is under control of the unconscious nervous system, the autonomic nervous system. And under normal circumstances, it is a one-way movement, right? There's one exception, and that is if in the presence of something noxious, or if you eat something bad or whatever, the peristaltic action can reverse, and that's when you throw up. And that's a survival mechanism. Okay, if you eat something bad, then the best thing for the body to do is try to get rid of it as quickly as possible before it passes into the digestive system. That's the origin of the vomiting reflex. Okay, let's have a look. See, we'll follow along as we chew and eat food, because it's actually a very complex process. And so I'm just going to point out some of the features of the anatomy of the mouth and everything else. So here's the mouth. The tongue is tremendously important. First of all, the sense of taste, I'll tell you, is a mixture of some basic taste responses in the tongue. The tongue actually is rather a crude tasting mechanism. And most of our sense of taste comes from senses both in our nose and in our palate, combined with information which the tongue is giving us. But the tongue's real importance is in mixing the food that is being chewed and producing a ball of food mixed with saliva, which has a certain unity to it, and that is called the bolus. And as the tongue will pass the bolus to the back of the throat, and once it reaches the back of the throat, there is an instinctive swallowing reflex that will start the process of swallowing. Swallowing is a very complicated thing, because what we need to remember is we've got a tube, right, which is going to lead to our gut, but this is our pharynx. And remember what we saw in the evolution of the vertebrates, that coming off the pharynx, there is also the airway leading to the lungs. And there has to be a very, very skillful mechanism to prevent food from going down the airway, because that is a deadly situation. People die from having food go down the airway. It can happen, but it's definitely not supposed to. And to prevent it, there is a valve. And here it is here. It's called the epiglottis. And the epiglottis is visible. It lies behind the tongue. And under normal circumstances, the epiglottis is up, and it allows us to breathe. At the same time, there's a sphincter here called the esophageal sphincter. And that when we're breathing, that esophageal sphincter is closed, so that you don't inhale any. You don't you don't inhale and swallow at the same time. The sphincter is closed to close off the esophagus. When you swallow food, the epiglottis comes down. Oops, where am I? The epiglottis will come down. It will close off the top of the airway like this, and the esophageal sphincter will open. And that is opening of the esophageal sphincter, the passage of the bolus below through the esophageal sphincter, sets off this peristaltic motion in the esophagus, which completes the swallowing action. You can try this out yourself if you want to. You can actually swallow quite easily when you're upside down. If you stand on your head and you put you eat something get the bolus to the back of the throat, you can quite easily swallow it. And this will still work. It will still work even upside down. It will push rather than pull the bolus into the stomach. And so this drops the bolus into the stomach. It may remain there for some hours, depending on how rapidly a particular food is digested. So let's have a look at the stomach. The stomach's a very complex organ. And it is actually a glandular organ. As we sort of tend to think of our stomachs as just being a storage place, they're not. The walls of the stomach are muscular. They will begin to churn material inside them and mix it very vigorously. So they're going to take the bolus, and they're going to mix the different boluses together, and they're going to start churning together with different substances produced by the stomach. This is what the walls of the stomach, if you just look at the surface, this is what they look like. But if they're kind of folded and everything, but every now and again you'll see that there's what we refer to as a crypt. There are pits in the wall of the stomach, and they lead to these glandular chambers underneath. These glands here consist of two kinds of cell. The first are called parietal cells. They're shown here in yellow. They look less common, and they produce hydrochloric acid. They produce ions of hydrochloric acid, and that is liberated to the stomach. The glands, the tissue here, the epithelial tissue here, is protected with a mucus layer from its own, to protect it from its own acids. But what the stomach cells really need protection from is digestion by the stomach enzyme, which is pepsin. Pepsin is a very, very powerful protease. And it is produced by these cells, shown here in pink, which are called chief cells. And the chief cells produce a substance called pepsinogen. It is not the active enzyme. It's a precursor to the enzyme pepsin. And it is released, along with a lot of mucus, by the way, is released into the stomach itself. And the acidity of the stomach activates the pepsinogen and converts it to pepsin, which is the enzyme which is going to start digesting the proteins that are presented in the food. All this churning and digestion and everything produces a substance called chyme, and the chyme is extremely acidic because of the hydrochloric acid, and it's really like a pre-digested. The digestion processes have not really proceeded completely by any means. The chyme is passed through into the small intestine, and that first part of the small intestine is called the duodenum. And in the duodenum, this is where the chyme is mixed with substances, especially from the pancreas. The pancreas produces, first of all, it produces bicarbonate, and the bicarbonate neutralizes the acid. The pepsin actually stops working. But the pancreatic enzymes, which we'll talk about in a minute, the pancreatic enzymes are activated at the lower pH that's produced by the bicarbonate ions. And the pancreas produces a whole suite of different enzymes. The most important ones that we'll think about are trypsin, carboxypeptidase, chymotrypsin. These are all activated in the duodenum, but it also produces lipases. Now, these are all proteases. And the proteases will break down not only they'll break down cells completely. They'll begin to open up animal cells, at least. They'll begin to break them down completely and break down the component proteins into amino acids. But the pancreas also secretes lipases, which break down lipids and will break them down into fatty acids. There is some difficulty in dealing with oils and lipids in the gut, because lipids, of course, are not soluble, and they tend to form large droplets. And so the chyme is mixed with substances from the liver, and especially with bile. Bile is actually a byproduct. It's produced by the liver, but it is a byproduct of the processing of dead blood, dead hemoglobin. And it produces a substance which emulsifies fats. It reduces fats to very, very small digestible droplets. And that now begins to pass. This whole mixture now of digested proteins, fats, and everything begins to pass through the rest of the intestine. The small intestine itself also produces digestive enzymes, mostly proteases of one sort or another. The peristalsis moves all of this material through the small intestine. Most of the digestion is completed in the upper part of the small intestine. And the lower part of the small intestine, which is called the jejunum and the ileum, are mainly devoted to absorption. Digestion does continue, but most of the absorption of the small molecules that result from the digestion, most of them are absorbed in the lower part of the small intestine. Now, when you look at the structure of the small intestine, it's very, very complex. First of all, the walls of the small intestine are cast into folds themselves, like this. But then if we look at the structure of the epithelium of the small intestine, we see that it is itself cast into these, they look like finger-like projections. And these have within them their own blood vessels here. This whole unit here is called a villus, plural villi. So if we were to look at the wall here, we would see many, many of these finger-like projections sticking up, the villi. Very, very importantly, here in the middle here, you can see this tube here. This is an extension of the lymphatic system. It's a lymph vessel, and it has its own little finger-like projector here called a lacteal. And we'll see its function in a minute. It has a special dedicated function. But here's the blood system. Most of the absorbed material, of course, is going to pass into the venous system. The arterial system here is supplying all the oxygen and everything that the organism, the cells of the villus need. But all absorbed material is actually going to pass into the venous system. And we're going to see it has a special fate, a special route that it takes through the circulatory system. Now, the villus here is, these villi increase the surface area immensely of the small intestine, but that's not the last kind of complication. Because if we look at the actual cells, at the epithelial cells that cover the villus, we'll see that they themselves, the surface here is forms a dense network of what we call it a brush border of these finger-like projections of the cell membrane, which further increase the cell's surface area. So when you look at the overall surface area of the small intestine, it is huge. Our small intestine is about 21 feet long, something like that. but it just has a huge surface area because of all of these complicated foldings and everything else. So here you can see the brush border here. Here's the villus, epithelium on the outside, and on the inside, the circulatory system. Here's the venous system in blue here. I never like that because they're not actually red and blue. It's just convention that they get colored like that. But in the center here, there is a lymph vessel with a projection called the lacteal, and there it is there. These are the microvilli, the brush board, the extensions of the cell itself that form the brush border. They are called the microvilli. The cells of the small intestine are extremely active, metabolically active. They are actually quite short-lived, and they are continually replaced. But they're extremely metabolically active in the processes of absorption and then of passing material to the rest of the body. And they do so because they're so active. They have all of the structures that you would recognize: Golgi, endoplasmic reticulum, etc., etc. But here is the surface of the cell membrane cast into these microvilli to increase the surface area. So I've told you that the digested molecules that result from these complex digestive processes is absorbed by the venous system of the intestine. And it's all of the material absorbed by the intestines, whether it's food molecules or water molecules from the colon, whatever, passes into the venous system. But you may be used to the idea that that veins lead blood up to the heart, right? The veins take blood to the heart for pumping to the lungs and then back out oxygenated to the body. Well, there are, in some places in the body, there are kind of short circuits, and this is one of them. Instead of being taken directly to the heart, all the blood from the intestine passes through a set of vessels to a portal system. A portal system is a blood system which links two organs without the intervention of the heart. So the portal system links the intestine to the liver. And all of the material that has been absorbed by the body is processed by the liver, and it passes through the liver through a very intricate circulatory system before it is emptied into the inferior vena cava and goes to the heart. So all of our nutrient actually passes first through the liver. And many, many complex metabolic processes are performed in the liver, dealing with material that has been absorbed. So that is the hepatic portal system. I don't need you to remember the intricate names of it. Just remember, please, hepatic portal vein. That's the hepatic portal system. And it empties into the liver through the hepatic portal vein. Oh, are we going backwards? Oh, yes. Let me just, I know I'm going over time a little bit, but I just want to finish by telling you a bit about the function of the villus, one of its really important functions. And that is, there is something of a problem in the body dealing with oils and fats, because they are not water soluble, and so they have to be dealt with in a particular way, and their processing is done quite separately from processing of simple molecules which have resulted from most of the systems of digestion. The fats themselves, triglycerides, are first broken down by all of the processes of enzymes from the pancreas, for example, and some from the small intestine. And they're broken down by the lipases, which break them down into fatty acids, into much simpler units, the fatty acids. And these fatty acids can be absorbed by the cells of the intestine. Because they're also lipid, they can pass across the cell membrane quite easily. But then a strange set of processes takes place. They are rebuilt into fats, into small fats. And these fats are gathered together. This is all done by the Golgi apparatus and the endoplasmic reticulum. They are gathered together into clusters of triglycerides. Here they are here, and also of the other lipid substance, cholesterol. They is packaged together like this, and they become surrounded by a membrane. It's a single layer of phospholipids, and it also has proteins embedded in it. It's a rather strange thing. This is called a Kylo Micron. Here it is here. They are very, very small. This is a Kylo Micron. It's the size of a small organelle in the cell. And they are actually excreted from the intestinal cell, and they're picked up by the lacteal here. So they'll pass from the cells of the villus into the lacteal without going through the blood system. Instead, the oils, the fats, are passed into the lymphatic system. That is one of the functions of the lymphatic system, is to provide an initial transport system for fats. And ultimately, if you remember back to circulatory systems, then you'll remember that ultimately all of the lymphatic vessels all join together, bigger lymphatic vessels, and they ultimately empty into veins just before those veins enter the heart, especially the subclavian vein. The lymphatic vessels empty into the vessels leading directly into the heart. And we'll stop right there. I just need to remind you, please, I will send notice out, but I need to remind you that a week today, next Friday, that is March 5th, you have your second test. I will send some information out about that. Okay, thank you for your attention, and I'll see you again on Monday.